Hi everyone, I'm Kaylee from MixingLight, and I'm here today talking to Peter Postma, who's the Managing Director for the Americas at FilmLight's. Thank you so much for joining me, Peter. It's such a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you've had such an interesting career. I met you in your capacity as Managing Director at FilmLight, but you have worked at Kodak as a colour engineer prior to that, and you are an alumni of Rochester Institute of Technology. So I just wanted to begin by talking to you about this career trajectory, moving from Rochester to Kodak and then to FilmLight. These are three real staples of our industry. So can you tell me a little bit about what you studied at Rochester and how that led you to Kodak?
Yeah, I mean, some of it was just kind of being in the right place at the right time, I guess. But initially, my interest was actually more in just kind of computer graphics and video games in particular. So I initially was studying computer science at RIT, but I quickly found that on the technical side of things, I wasn't learning anything in school that I couldn't like kind of quickly learn myself just by reading textbooks and playing around and stuff like that. It was the creative side of making images and making movies that I needed feedback on. So after a year in computer science, I actually switched to the Department of Film and Animation, and ultimately graduated with a bachelor's of fine arts in film and animation. But as part of kind of my electives, of course, we have the Center for Imaging Science right next door to the School of Film and Animation. It says, oh, there's some interesting classes about color and vision over there. So I started taking those, and then, just kind of saw how I could kind of really tie together my interest on the technical side of things and my interest on the creative side of things by really focusing on color for our industry, because a lot of the resources out there for learning about color and stuff like that are much more focused on print press work and stills and stuff like that. There wasn't a lot focused on the motion picture industry. So it's kind of an exciting, area to study.
Definitely, and it still feels a little bit like that. I mean, I think, like you said, right place, right time. Rochester is one of the only universities that I'm aware of that does teach colour science and imaging science in a really meaningful way. I certainly know that here locally we don't have anything like it. And so after that, like Rochester and Kodak have a bit of a crossover of some kind. Is that right?
Yeah, so I mean, Rochester's an interesting town because it is kind of in the middle of nowhere, upstate New York. But it's the headquarters for Kodak, the headquarters for Xerox, the headquarters for Bausch and Lomb, which is a big lens company, of Corning, who makes glass for all kinds of optical devices. So it really is this kind of hub of kind of optics and color science and stuff like that. So luckily it was actually one of my professors in my last year at RIT who worked for Kodak and was just working as an adjunct professor who said, "Hey, there's this opportunity at Kodak you might want to apply for," and so I did, and I ended up being with Kodak for 5 years. But my first job there, actually, as just kind of an intern, was actually looking at different kind of digital image processing techniques for their laboratory, because it was really right at that cusp where things were starting to go, from film to digital, and what kind of tools did they want to have just for their own internal team to, kind of assess and process images. So.
Oh my goodness, that's fascinating to be on during that transition. And without implying anything about your age, can you tell me what year it was then?
This was around 2000. Yeah.
Around 2000. Okay. So
Yeah.
like a good 12 years before it kind of, that change to digital really happened in a sort of commercial way.
Yeah, so it was actually 2001 that I moved out to Los Angeles with Kodak, because I was initially just in Rochester. And I was still officially in Kodak, but I worked right next door to Cinesight, which was the place where some of the first DIs were done. So it was right
Wow.
after, like, A Brother Were Out There and one or two other films had been finished. So really right at the forefront of that whole DI thing. And I remember, I was on the team that helped build and deploy the first hardware that could apply a 3D lookup table in real time. So it was this crazy Sun Microsystems computer with all these FPGAs in it, just to be able to process a 3D LUT in real time, so the colorists could see, what the film would look like once they went to record and print it out. So, which is, just such a
Wow.
simple thing that every color corrector does now. You apply
I
LUTs all the time. You
know.
apply 3 or 4, but back at the time, that was quite novel. So,
Oh, that's unreal. I mean, we really take it for granted now, don't we?
yeah.
And was it during that time that you were part of the ASC committee to develop the CDL?
Yep. So right when the ASC Technology Committee formed, luckily the first meeting just happened to be on Kodak property, so I managed to get get in the room, so
Wow.
to speak, and start talking about it. And yeah, because I already had some experience supporting digital intermediate at that point, yeah, I was part of those early discussions as to building the CDL because it was quite clear at that time that things were going digital, but also just for supporting film, it used to be you would actually have you'd either rent out a movie theater on location or have like a trailer with a projector in it to actually do film dailies. And so this was around the time when film dailies were going away and digital dailies were starting to take over. So you were, scanning the film on a telecine every day. But the directors of photography saw that they were kind of losing a key bit of feedback that they got from the lab because it used to be, you could look at what your printer lights were every day and know kind of how things are going if you needed to like overexpose a little more, underexpose a little more, just if the film from the last day was good. But when you just get a DVD or something with your dailies on it, you don't really know, did the telecine operator have to do a whole bunch of work to make those dailies look good, or were they just sliding right into place as they should? So the CDL was originally kind of thinking as a way to be able to give feedback to DPs to say, here's some specific numbers so you can see if it is in fact being consistent every day, or if something changed and then, oh, maybe there's a problem with the film or a problem with the camera or something else with exposure, we need to go back and check, so to provide that kind of key bit of feedback.
I love that idea that the CDL isn't, so much of a grade as it is a communication tool between the departments because, that kind of ties into how CDLs are used now throughout the whole process. They're communicating that idea from set through to VFX and through to DI if you want to start there. And to have people who could look at those numbers and say, oh, this is what they must have done, it just never occurred to me that that was happening on the camera side. So yeah, that's really cool. I mean, with printer lights, it does seem a little bit more straightforward to say, oh, they put in, a stop of red or took out a stop of blue or what have you. But being only 10 numbers on a CDL, you could look at it and say, oh yeah, they changed the contrast and they, offset it up a bit. So
Right. Well, and that's actually one of the reasons why we went with slope offset power for CDL rather than lift gamma gain, is because in normal like lift gamma gain controls there is no straight offset. So if you wanted to do just printer lights, you actually need to combine two or three controls to do that. But when you have offset, that can be your printer light. So if you do want to kind of stay more in that kind of printer light mode, only have three numbers to work about, you can just use the offset part of the CDL, and so you only have to track three numbers still, so that would all still work.
and the beauty of that as well, that it's completely invertible, anything that goes up can just come down again or vice versa. So you maintain the linearity of the negative, which is, just a really great and useful thing to have for other departments anyway.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting to me that you've kind of been a part of these committees along the way that have, in a really large way, shaped the workflows and the way that we work every day. Um, and yet you're sort of not like a household name, so to speak. But you've certainly been there and kind of developed the way that we work today digitally. And you're continuing to do that. And I know I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but you're part of the ACES project at the moment as well, aren't you? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I started with ACEs again very early on, probably over 16 years ago. I mean, when the first
Wow.
seeds of ACEs were planted. So it was actually while I was still at Kodak.
Oh, okay.
And there was already this recognition that, again, things are going digital. We should have some kind of industry standard for how to process images. And it took a good, I think it was close to 10 years before ACES 1.0 finally came out and everyone could agree on, okay, this is kind of at least a good first step, if not everything we wanted it to be. Um, yeah, that was really just kind of encapsulating some of the best practices of the industry at the time to how to set up a color managed workflow. And that work continues because, again, when ACES started, it was still a very, very film centric. It was keeping in like a lot of time was spent on, okay, how do we bring film scans in to ACES and how do we get back out to film? And of course, these days, that's not so much of a concern as dealing with all the different digital cameras, dealing with high dynamic range display devices and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, the ACES committee is getting pretty close to releasing ACES 2.0, which is a kind of major upgrade that more directly takes on those those concerns of, yeah, super wide gamut devices, both on the camera end and the display end, and dealing with different dynamic ranges and all that kind of stuff in an even better way.
And that would be, I mean, there's recent developments in LED walls, and Unreal Engine, and utilizing backgrounds that have very saturated and potentially like out of gamut kind of luminosities and colors to them. Is that part of what you're looking at with ACES 2.0 as well?
Yes, I mean, Aces was always designed to be able to kind of accommodate any possible color. So any color the human eye can see, is able to be put in an Aces container. Um, and there's certain issues that Aces can't solve for you, but certainly it could be, again, that good foundation, that color managed workflow that things then fit into. So it's not going to have like a push button simple fix to make your screen match your camera and stuff like that, but it's part of the workflow you set up that makes that stuff easier and should make it consistent so that you can use the same approach no matter which LED wall you're shooting with or which camera you're shooting with. That I think is the biggest thing, is to uh, not have to be dependent on, like, different specific manufacturer solutions, so that, like, okay, if I'm shooting with a Samsung wall one day and a Sony wall the other, I have to do like completely different techniques just to bring it again to a basic industry standard. Then you could put your special sauce on top of that, but at least the basic workflow is the same no matter what you're doing.
It's fascinating, like the complexity of that, just trying to deal with all of the variations. Has there been anything particularly challenging technology wise along the way, like, in terms of film going out and digital coming in, or any particular technologies that have been tough nuts to crack?
That's a good question. I mean, I consider myself very lucky to have started my career when film was still around, so that I could learn like a lot from the limitations really of the photochemical process, but how much the engineers at Kodak were be able to do to get like great looking images out of that. Um, and to me, being the young guy in the room, a lot of the times in those days, it was quite clear that digital was the future, that film only had so much life left on it. But there were, yeah, a lot of lessons learned that could then be applied in digital. And digital should be a lot simpler because there's so much intricacy involved in the photochemical process for film. There's this whole industry that supports all the different technologies that you need to be able to lay down the chemicals on a strip of film to expose it, but then also the laboratories which can then develop it and turn that into an actual image and everything. It's, if someone were to try to build that infrastructure today, it would just be impossible. Whereas digital is supposed to, I thought digital was going to be a lot simpler. It's just like you've got pure numbers you can look at, you can go back to those same numbers. You have that magical undo button that we have in digital. But yeah, because as you say, there's constant technology changes, there's new sensor technologies, there's new display technologies. That's, I think, the trickiest part really, is not any one particular device that has, or technology uh, that's presented a problem. It's just you have to keep up with all these different things that are being produced in all these different corners of the workflow that then keep pushing it and evolving it. But I think the biggest change, obviously, in the last few years has been high dynamic range displays, both laser projectors in the theater that can get a lot brighter and a lot darker, so of much better contrast, and HDR displays in the home. And we did some very early work with FilmLight, with Dolby, on their early HDR kind of technology and stuff like that. But the biggest hurdles, I think, for HDR actually ended up not being technical. They ended up being creative. It's like, okay, we now have this widely expanded palette. How are we going to take advantage of it? And I think that's something we're still kind of figuring out as an industry, is, yeah, what's the best way to use HDR? And that answer is often different for every project. How much of that extended highlight range, how much of that extended saturation range do you want to take advantage of? And or when do you know when to kind of be reserved and not push it just because it's there?
Yeah, those the aesthetics of standard dynamic range have been around for 100 years, and we kind of have a sense of where culturally we think skin tones should sit and where highlights should sit, but we're kind of, yeah, like you say, it's a new frontier creatively as well. And I think another level of complexity, which I'd love to understand as well, is that working for companies like Kodak and now FilmLight, you're in a position to be supporting and contributing globally. and, different cultures and different locations have different standards. So, sometimes I forget that there are whole other workflows out there and whole other displays, in China and in, the East and other places. Can you comment at all about dealing with those kinds of different culturally used technologies as well? I don't know how to say that properly, but
Yeah, no, I think, because I am more on the technology side, helping the creatives do what they do, my biggest thing is just to, provide the tools that people can so they can take advantage of those new technologies and kind of guide them a little bit as to how we think they're supposed to be used, but then listening to the creatives once they say, "Oh, I like this, I don't like this," and just constantly evolving that. And yeah, you're right; it can be very different for different cultures. I mean, even if you look at just like stereoscopic, which had a big resurgence a couple years ago, it's still actually quite huge in China. For whatever reason, in China, they really like their stereoscopic 3D movies. So we still have to maintain our 3D tools, even though it's much less common, in the U.S. and Europe and some other parts of the world. But yeah, so we maintain all those tools, and if someone in our sides of the world wants to take advantage of it, they're there to take advantage of. But if they don't, they don't have to. So yeah.
So we've talked about being at Rochester and Kodak. What was the work that you were doing at Kodak as a color engineer? Like, what would a day look like in that role?
So initially, as I said, it was kind of just evaluating software tools that were in the industry for people at the research lab at Kodak to use. So it was because Kodak, of course, had developed the Cineon software, which was one of the first
Oh,
digital compositing
yes.
software, and that used to be their own internal tool as well. But once Kodak abandoned that, again, technology and industry moved on, so they needed to move on too. So I was helping them evaluate, okay, what can they do with Shake, which was another compositor, or Raise, which was a new compositor at the time that was coming out, and also just different tools for dealing with digital still cameras. And so actually, once I had kind of done my initial evaluation on those different devices, that's when I got involved in a project, which eventually be called the Kodak Look Management System, where you could take an image with a digital still camera and then put that through a film emulation to see, well, what would this look like if I shot with 5218 negative, or what would it look like if I shot with a slower speed film? What would it look like if I did a bleach bypass or things like that? So we had these digital emulations of all these photochemical processes, and so when the director and the DP are on set deciding, what stock they want to go to, what film process they want to use to, they could shoot an image with a digital still camera on the day, put it through the software, and emulate all those different things.
Wow.
So for a couple years, I was involved in that project and managing, kind of profiling different SLR cameras to get them into that software, and then making sure we're accurately emulating those different processes. Yeah.
What kind of tools did you use to do that? Were you like, looking at things through a microscope, or like, how
It's
does one do that?
it really is a mix of things, and a lot of it was kind of just homegrown by some of the color scientists I work with, and just kind of evolved over the years. So a lot of it was just standard densitometry. So like you record out a bunch of film patches, or different densities on film, and then measure that with a densitometer, and you take that information, or you measure it with a spectrophotometer, so you can get the full spectrum of the light that's shining through the film, and capture that and put it into your model. For profiling like the digital still cameras, we actually came up with this little device that had a piece of dichroic glass in it that you could slide up and down to basically capture the full spectrum of light. So we had a full spectrum white light behind this dichroic glass that you could shift in like exact increments, and basically take a whole bunch of stills to profile, basically how it was seeing each wavelength of light, and get a full
Wow.
profile then of how how that digital sensor reproduced light, match that up with your measurements of the film, and that's how you kind of got the emulation between the two. So yeah.
That's unreal. I mean, that kind of physical thing, I don't think a lot of us actually take into account that there are like prisms and bits of glass. Like, that feels like something that happened in like the 1800s when they were first learning about the different colors of light and things, but obviously it's still a part of practice today, just in a more sophisticated way. But
Yep.
I've never once in my life, gotten a prism and looked at light through it. I just think, wow, that's really interesting. And so When you moved over to FilmLight, were you doing similar kinds of work there, or was that a bit of a shift for you?
It was a bit of a shift, but not radically. So my first job at FilmLight was supporting our TrueLight color management software, and it was going in and helping people calibrate their DI theaters to match, what they were ultimately going to see on film. Because at that time, film was still considered the hero deliverable for most shows. Digital cinema was already starting to roll out, but since most people were seeing theater, most DPs and directors were used to seeing film in a theater. They kind of considered film their main primary deliverable, so they wanted to make sure when they're color grading in DI that they're seeing as close as possible what the film is ultimately going to look like. So that was again, yeah, measuring film with densitometers to make sure we're accurately profiling the output of that facility's specific film recorder and the lab that they were working with, and then measuring with a probe the projector to see how it's reproducing light, and again, meshing those two together to make the digital projector look as close as possible to film. So yeah, there's a lot of running around. It was just fun, is because FilmLight's a very international company, and there were a lot of different corners of the world that were starting to get into DI. So I traveled around quite a bit. Yeah, just going into these different DI theaters, helping them calibrate their rooms and set them up for DI.
I bet they looked good, like once they'd all been calibrated. I bet they were looking the best they'll ever look.
Yeah, of course, the trickiest thing with film is that because it's a photochemical process, it's not 100% locked down. So that was always the frustrating thing, is that, we could always exactly match what the lab did yesterday. The question is that what's going to come out of the lab tomorrow? So sometimes you have these, awkward conversations where you have to say, like, I know what I'm doing and the lab is at fault here, or, kind of figure out, or are we doing something wrong? And so, yeah, it's kind of funny that in those days, again, towards the end of DI, like, I think film laboratories were at their absolute best because, you have this rock solid digital projector to compare it to now. So the post house could say, hey, the lab was a little off today. We got to reprint this. You got to fix what you're doing. So the labs actually got better at they were doing. It had much tighter controls as well. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting to be able to side by side it. I find today that I'm constantly hearing back from clients that, oh, we just watched the DCP and it's not looking the same as it did in the grade suite. And, and then you have to say, well, have you measured the screen? Do you know if the lamp's at its full brightness? You've got so many questions. And
Yeah.
commercial cinemas, I don't think are doing that level of calibration, but it's that thing of just, being able to say to somebody, look, when we looked at it during the DI, it was correct there, and if it's deviating, at least we know where it's deviating from, right? Like, it's
Right.
because you can't control every screen, but wouldn't it be nice to be able to send someone out and say, yeah, okay, it's going to get calibrated before you screen for this short film festival or something?
Well, yeah, I'm lucky enough to live in Los Angeles, where some facilities, certainly for larger titles, will do that. If they're going to have a big film premiere, or they know that it's an important screening, they will actually send someone out to measure the screen and make sure it's properly set up. Because, yeah, that is one of the most frustrating things I think about what we do, is that yeah, you can always trust that in a calibrated environment is going to look great, but once it gets onto someone's screen in their home, who knows if they'll actually be seeing what you intended or not. So yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I do joke that it'd be nice to send my Sony monitor out for everyone to look at things on and just ditch their iPads and phones and TVs. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, we can't provide everyone with that.
At the same time, one of my favorite anecdotes was from a DP I talked to who watched digital dailies on his laptop, and he said it was great because he could grade them himself. If he wanted them a little darker, he'd just tilt his laptop that way. If he wanted them brighter, just tilt his laptop that way. So he just grade his dailies by tilting his screen. So
Oh my goodness! Oh, that gives me the chills. I don't like that at all.
for dailies, that's fine, I think. But yeah,
Yeah, for
certainly once you get
dailies,
to the
it's
final,
fine.
you don't want to be leaving it to that. Yeah.
It worries me, especially in short form, what some people are watching things on their phones, at the pub or something.
Yeah.
So going all over the world and calibrating things and using the TrueLight system, I mean, was the TrueLight system sort of in existence before Baselight was? Was that like
Yeah.
before Baselight or part of Baselight? How did that work?
So FilmLight actually got started as kind of like the R&D group from Computer Film Company. And all our first three main products, the Northlight scanner, the Baselight color correction system and true light color management, early versions of that all existed in CFC before it split off and became a separate company called FilmLight, where we said, hey, we can, bring these tools to the industry at wide. It doesn't have to be, just for this one company. So Northlight was actually, our scanner was the first product that really kind of took off. Um, TrueLight and Baselight kind of came out at around the same time, but TrueLight definitely got traction a lot quicker because TrueLight would work with any color correction setup, any kind of theater, and obviously, if you don't have that basic color correction in place, you can't even start to begin to do a DI. So yeah, actually, when I joined FilmLight, I didn't really know much about Baselight at all. I said, "Oh, well, this TrueLight stuff is rock solid. I've seen it before. I'm happy to go out and utilize it. This Baselight thing is kind of interesting, but I haven't seen it. I don't know what it does." And but as I was working with the other people at FilmLight, I said, "Oh, wow, there's actually something really great here." Yeah, so Baselight was kind of the last product to grow up and get widespread adoption. But
And you hadn't
yeah,
done color correction yourself prior to that?
only technical kind of color correction. So I knew how to like drive a DaVinci 2K and how to drive a Poggle, but mostly just for how to set up a telecine the right way. Another one of the projects I worked on at Kodak. I've actually forgotten the name of it, but
That's
it
okay.
was a product to again kind of make the film transfer process more consistent and set up a telecine more like a scanner. So you could take, whether it's a Spirit scan telecine or a ITK or whatever. We developed some reference calibration film that you would put on the telecine with specific targets that you'd have to, adjust the knobs to hit, and then you would know that your telecine was actually making kind of standard Cineon scans, much more like a film scanner that would be used for VFX and things like that. So I knew how to drive the controls to do that kind of technical grading, but never creative grading. Now.
Did you ever sort of get the bug for creative color grading, or have you always felt more like the technology was who you are?
Yeah, well, I'm very cognizant of the fact that, being a colorist, a huge part of your job is kind of client management and client communication. It's developing that language with them about what does it mean when they say they want something redder or brighter or darker or that sort of stuff. And I fully respect that. And I kind of decided that's interesting, but that's not what I want to do. I want to
Got
focus
you.
more on kind of what's going on under the hood. And yeah, certainly, like one of the great things I think about Baselight is that there's strong color science underpinning all our tools and everything we do, and that's part of why I think we can, explain why the tools are the way they are, is because we've really thought through. Like, we don't just want to make some knob that makes the image look zazzy, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's actually like, why are we doing the image processing this way? Is this the best way to do that's going to give you the most control over the image and keep things looking natural and not just like all electronic and weird. So yeah, I really like being a part of that process of developing those creative tools and then handing them over to people who can get inside other people's heads and figure out how to actually get the images they want out of it. So.
Yeah, it is such a different like discipline, isn't it, to understand the technology that underpins it as opposed to being able to deploy it in a session. But you've trained a lot of colorists. I'd be surprised if you couldn't sit down and grade something pretty well.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I could. I've done a few like indie projects and for friends and stuff like that. But yeah, again, it's just I just decided that wasn't what I wanted for my career. So.
So when I spent some time with you and you trained me, you showed me through the current features as well as some of the new features that are coming out in version 6 of Baselight. And I just wanted to talk about a few of them because it's actually quite fascinating to me, because prior to that I hadn't had such a huge kind of interaction with Baselight, and I was kind of taken aback by just how, like you said, thought through the tools were. So one thing which I really enjoyed were the tools that worked in the perceptual color space. Can you talk to me about those? That was base grade mainly in version 5.
Yeah, so the big evolution I think in Baselight over the past few years has been focused on tools that really emulate the physics of light and the way our eye reacts to light. So as opposed to like our early tools like film grade tried to emulate what happens in a film lab when you adjust printer lights or, vary the processing a little bit to adjust contrast. And video grade emulates what happened in a telecine, which of course was originally kind of analog voltage adjustments. So really just trying to uh, work with the limited tools they had at the time to adjust the color. So with base grade, which debuted a few years ago, that was really one of our first major attempts to say, okay, we have this color management in place now. We can know what the original light coming into the camera looks like. We know how the human eye works. So let's make a grading tool that acts more like a camera does and more like the human eye does. So instead of grading in some RGB space, whether that's based on the camera sensitivity to RGB or your display's reproduction of RGB, let's say we'll just work in human perceptual space because that's what color is. It's the name we give to how the human eye sees light. So let's focus on that. And so yeah, we brought it into this human perceptual space, and we just made the tools work consistently to the way uh, DPs and other filmmakers think about color in terms of stops of exposure or color temperature, rather than just kind of like arbitrary RGB numbers. So.
And so, in order to do that, because there has been a lot of research into how the eye sees, did you take that research and translate it into like a digital map of some kind? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah. I mean, there is a lot of research done on human vision, and there still is stuff that we don't really completely understand. I think, like we have a complete physical model of the eyeball and how the cells in our retina work and all that, but then there's this big squishy brain behind it, and that's the part that you can't exactly just like pick apart. So there's still some stuff that happens in our visual processing that we're not quite sure why it happens or what part of the brain it happens in and that sort of stuff. But certainly for the initial part of the eye, that's all very well modeled. And so, yeah, we were able to take some academic research papers that model that behavior and kind of trim the bits we didn't need to simplify it to get it running in real time and that kind of stuff to actually, yeah, do the conversion into the visual space and then adjust the colors in there.
And so you were talking about color management, and color management workflows have been really important to you throughout your whole career. And one thing which I was interested in Baselight was that you're always working color managed. You can't get outside of that.
Right.
So within that color management system, you have like another little bubble for this tool. So it's working within another color space, but that's all handled automatically within Baselight. Is that right?
Yeah, so of course the way the color management system works is it first have to know like what camera was used to acquire the image. So most of the time for camera original footage, we'll know if it was shot on Red or Sony or Arri or GoPro or what have you. So we've profiled all those cameras and can bring them from that camera native color space into whatever color space you want. And yeah, for our what I call like our legacy tools, like the video grade for lift gamma gain or film grade or stuff like that, you can choose what color space you want to work in. So you could say, I'm primarily in Arri show shooting Alexa. So even though there's a few shots done on Canon camera or a few shots done on Red, I can actually bring them all into the Arri color space and grade with it there, so my tools feel consistent. But then beyond that, yeah, when you get to base grade and some of our new tools like X grade and Chromogen, they work in their own internal color space, which is that human perceptual space. Uh, uh, and so, yeah, that basically lets us emulate those real world processes, regardless of what camera you shot with at the start.
In terms of the way that it looks, it's hard to describe it, talking about it. But when you're actually using it as a colorist, I was so happy with how, like, mainly saturation was mapped. If you saturate an image in base grade, you never get into those kind of electric colors that you can reach when you've got Rec. 709 primaries controlling your saturation. So
Right.
it's definitely something that's worth every colorist, if you're, no matter what system you use, just jumping in to the Baselight Look software, which is now available. You can just download it to learn and play. It is worth jumping in and just seeing what base grade does and how it reacts, because it is a slightly different experience when you're grading. You might be used to offset grading, but to have these controls like flare and the ranges, like you've got bright and dim and dark and light, I think it is, on the two panels. I hope I got that right.
Yep. Yep.
They all operate just a little bit differently from other tools we might be used to using, and especially the flare control. I mean, it's just worth having a play.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean that's good to hear. It means we did our job. So,
Well, it is
um,
super good fun. And you also mentioned another couple of tools that work in that perceptual color space, which is X-Grade and Chromagen, which are V6 tools that are coming out. Are they in beta
yep,
at the moment? Is that right?
that's correct. Yep.
Can you tell me about those? Because they are just something else.
Yeah. So X grade is a tool that's again kind of plots all the colors in a human perceptual space. So it's not exactly the same as the space that base grade uses actually, but it kind of plots the colors out so that an equal amount of change in that tool will be perceived the same as your eye, because we're, for instance, more sensitive to changes in like blue and purple hues than we are in green hues, or for saturation the same way we're more sensitive to saturations in some color than in others. So that color space first of all kind of smooths everything out so that if you're making the same amount of change in X grade, you're going to perceive the same amount of change with your eye. And it basically, when we built it, we looked at other tools which allow you to manipulate the full color space as kind of a mesh to be able to like basically just push colors around and mold them like clay. And we found it was a really interesting way to adjust colors, but also a really quick way to destroy the image, because you can quickly get images crossing over with each other, causing banding artifacts and tearing and noise and stuff like that. So we said, how could we do this more smoothly and more consistently to get a good result? And the first was moving it from an RGB color space into this human perceptual space where everything is evenly weighted for all the colors. And then the second was, rather than like just manipulating a 3D lookup table directly, let's make it so you have kind of areas of influence, almost like you are molding clay and pushing stuff around, so that when you push really hard in the green and then you push the red direction in another way, it kind of pulls a little bit of it with it, so you don't get that tearing. You're just constantly kind of molding the colors around. And yeah, it just ended up kind of being this really organic way to quickly do what would normally be secondary color corrections. So normally, if you wanted to make your reds a little bit more orange and make your greens more saturated and make your blues darker, you'd have to do 3 different keys and a bunch of windows and stuff to protect for exactly what you wanted to affect. But with X-Grade, you just kind of grab that part of the color space, push it the direction you want to go, and do the same in the 3 other color spaces, and Base Grade automatically interpolates and smooths between them so that you're not getting any of those artifacts.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried pushing it every way you can imagine, and like you say, like one point will always affect the others, and it'll protect you from going into crazy town. Another feature that I really like about it is the neutral line that runs through the center. So it did take me a little while to get my head around exactly what that was doing, but it looks almost like degrees Kelvin running through.
Yeah, exactly. We kind of highlight where the standard black body white points are, so that if you do want to keep stuff more neutral, of course, there's as no such thing as being truly neutral, because you're always neutral with respect to some white point. So you can decide kind of what that white point is. But we also have, yeah, kind of like an anchor so that it keeps stuff that is close to neutral more neutral. So when you're pushing other stuff around, you're not suddenly pushing, your grays towards red, your grays towards green and stuff like that. So that was, yeah, kind of another key component we realized early on, is that normally you want to keep your neutral scale kind of grounded and be pushing the colors around it rather than shifting the whole
Mm.
image. But you can take that pin out if you do want to go crazy and push everything around. You can do that too. So
It's also really nice to just have that representation on screen, because it can show, like I was playing with it the other day and looking at, oh, I wanted to grab this warm color and which direction do I want to push it in? Well, if I push it down the neutral line, it's cleaning up and becoming neutralized. If I push it the other way, it's getting more orange. So, for me, it's like almost a part of a map for me to know where I am in space as well. And it's also got ranges, which I was having a play with and discovering the other day as well. So you can do a little bit of work more so in your dim zone or more so in your bright zone if you switch it over. So I think there's like any of these tools, they start off looking quite simple, like, oh, okay, it's a color warper. And then you start to change a few parameters and you're like, oh, wow, okay, this can really do some pretty cool stuff in terms of look. But yeah, definitely the, utilizing it. That's another thing which I really like about the tools in Baselight as a whole, is that there are a lot of tools in the main grading options that can save you from going to secondaries. So hue shift is one that I would use every time.
Right.
It might be my favorite tool. Being able to alter the value of a hue and, brighten skin tone a little bit and perhaps darken a background a bit rather than adding a window for a face or darkening off a background with a vignette. I can just do that right there in the main page. So, is that something that you guys are interested in particularly, is keeping away from the secondaries? Or
Yeah, that was definitely a thing we consciously worked on, because anytime you do a secondary, you're literally like carving out a part of the image, treating it totally differently, and then trying to slap it back into that original image. So that's always going to be problematic. That's why, yeah, anytime you pull a key, you have to go and watch it through, check for noise, smooth it out, blur it, throw a window on it so it's only affecting the part of the image you want. There's all these kind of extra steps you have to do. That eats up a lot of time. And again, it's just not the best thing for the image, because you're really now kind of taking things down a different path, and that's something that ideally uh, you should never have to do. If you're able to capture an image you're happy with, you should be able to just yeah, kind of mold it to what you want it to do without having to tear it apart. So yeah, we're not going to completely replace secondary color correction. There will always be those times where you do want to be, super isolated with what you do, or do have to attack a very specific part of the image where they weren't able to get light in on the day on set, or that sort of thing. But for the vast majority of stuff, if it's lit pretty well, you shouldn't have to carve up the image like that. And not having to worry about that, to constantly have to go back and check, oh, is the key noisy here? Oh, is it tracking through the whole length of this shot? Just saves a tremendous amount of time in color correction, because you quickly, with these primary tools, you quickly develop the trust that, okay, if I grade it well on this frame, that's going to translate well to all these other versions of the shot. And you don't necessarily have to carefully QC them all when you're setting the look. You just know it's going to work. So.
You're definitely time savers for sure. I can see X grade adding a lot of productivity to people's workflows. Chromagen is another new tool in V6, which to me is just like its own beast. It could be its own program.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about Chromagen?
Yeah, so Chromagen is a look development tool. So as opposed to Xgrade, which is very much for kind of shot by shot grading, adjusting each shot individually, Chromagen is a set of tools to help you develop a look that you might apply to a whole sequence or even to a whole show. Um, and we develop the tools again in a human perceptual space, so that when you're manipulating colors, you're doing it based on sound photochemical photographic principles and the way the human eye works. um, and it's specifically designed to kind of be broad enough strokes that they do translate well across a variety of different shooting conditions and images. So you can't be too isolated with the controls. Like you can't do what you would do with a color key or stuff like that, specifically so that it will hold up to a wide range of shots. But yeah, what we found was that even with all the color tools in Baselight, there are some color operations which are often a part of look development that aren't easy to emulate with current color tools. So, particularly when you think about like emulating a film look, there's a lot of crosstalk that happens between the color channels. So, like when you expose something that's green on film, it's not just affecting the magenta dye layer, which is where green's recorded. It's actually bleeding into the cyan and layers as well a little bit. So we developed matrices and things like that, which can emulate that process on a technical level, but artistically, that wasn't something there was really a tool in the color corrector that could handle. So we specifically want to make sure, okay, we can adjust those, yeah, kind of crosstalk effects between the color channels, but then also just kind of where do you put the bumpers on your look? So like if you want to be able to know that, the look for this show, has a certain the red has a certain quality to it. Like you always want to skew towards a certain red. And that could be, for a commercial where it's like a particular brand color you want to make sure you're staying on, or it could be, just when you're developing a feature film or a TV show or something like that. Like there's certain kind of signature colors you want that look to have. And that's something you can do shot by shot, with hue shift and tools like that to kind of consistently push things towards the same flavor of red or towards the same flavor of blue. But Chromogen lets you do that, as part of your basic look development to say, okay, I want all my reds to look like this, and I want my dark reds to be this way and my brighter reds to be this way, or I don't want to allow my reds to be too saturated, but I do want my blues and greens to be saturated. So you kind of can define the color space on which you're going to grade, and then once you've set that look for the show, you're just kind of, grading, doing your adjustments shot to shot underneath that, but the broad strokes of the look are then set. But yeah, it did end up becoming almost a color corrector within a color corrector, because it's got a whole bunch of tools for how you set up that color space that you're going to work within, or that color palette really that you're defining for your show. But the
And
idea
these
is that,
these are the
yeah,
stages, aren't they? The stages that you
yes,
have with all of the different sort of, would you call them tools within the stages or
yeah.
options or?
Well, I mean, we could just as easily call them layers, but we didn't want to confuse them with, the layers that are already within your main grading stack in Baselight. So that's why we opted to call them stages. And yeah, each one of those operators, I guess you could say, yeah, just kind of a slightly different way of tweaking the color, and you can combine them in different ways to kind of cover the whole color space you want to cover. So
Yeah, so I suppose, where you might otherwise use a look or perhaps a LUT or, create some curves that you're going to put across everything, you would use Chromogen instead. And using those stages, insert different tools that are meaningful to the project you're on, like color crosstalk or contrast or um, there's a few that I'd never heard of before. Like, can you talk me through? Do you remember off the top of your head what the stages are? Because
um,
I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but there was some that I was like, I wouldn't know what that was if I hadn't seen it here.
well, yeah, some of them are named just because we had to come up for the terminology, which isn't something that regularly gets talked about. So in some ways we're choosing the terms. They're not, industry standard
Right, right.
terms.
I thought I'd missed a
Uh,
memo.
no, but yeah, a lot of it came out of, for a long time in Baselight, we've had this look tool, which allows you to apply preset looks. So if you want a Kodak film look or a Fujifilm look or a reversal as negative look or a bleach bypass look, you could apply those, but they were like lookup tables. They were kind of, you could turn them on or off. You could vary the strength a little bit, but that was it. Like if you really liked the film look, but you just didn't like the way the greens came out, you wanted the greens to be, more yellow or less yellow or whatever. It was kind of hard to tweak that look because everything is all tied together in this one LUT basically that gets applied or not. So with Chromogen, we're able to reproduce those same kind of looks. We can produce different film looks. We can produce different photochemical processes, or just other creative looks. But now they're broken down into steps, so you can tweak just the parts you want. So you can say, yeah, I love the Kodak film look, but I don't want my highlights to be warmer. I want them to stay neutral, or I do want my greens to be a little more green and a little less yellow. So you can tweak just those parts of the look that you want, rather than it being kind of all or nothing thing that you would get with a LUT.
And are they going to be presets? Because I feel like if it was a preset, I'd be reaching for it all the time.
That's the way actually I recommend most people introduce themselves to Chromogen is, yeah, we have a set of presets. Some of them match the existing looks in Baselight. Some of them are totally new. But yeah, I think that's certainly the way I learn and am able to wrap my head around things often, is just by kind of just looking at examples of what works and then picking it apart and seeing,
Yeah.
how it got there. So
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely recommend people look at the presets and then just kind of, just turn things on and off, adjust the knobs, see what each step is doing, and then you start to really wrap your head around it. So.
I mean, that's another one that's well worth having a play with. I know it's still in beta, but there are various places that are running the beta that you may be able to get your hands on it. Or, of course, there's a lot of materials out there on the FilmLight website about, showing you what it's going to do. And who made that one? Whose baby was that?
It's Daniele Circosano. So it's Daniele Circosano, who's one of our image pipeline engineers based out of Germany. He was really the chief architect on that, working closely with Richard Kirk, who's another one of our color scientists in London.
Ah.
So yeah.
Wow. Okay. So I imagine that he's got a range of resources that you could look at. Is that, I seem to have seen a couple of things float into my inbox that he's doing talks about it.
Yes, yeah. So there's a number of videos already, and certainly once version 6 launches, there'll be a bunch more resources out there for to kind of explain what all those different steps in the tool do. Yeah.
And you mentioned Richard Kirk as well. And just a side note, if anyone is interested in colour science at all, which you probably are if you're listening to this interview, his book, Colour Sense and Measurement, is well worth a read. And I believe you can actually get a PDF of it online. So
Yeah, there's
well worth
information on
checking it out.
on the FilmLight website, and it's definitely a great read because there's very few, as I said early on, kind of resources for color in our industry. A lot of them are focused on uh, pre-press and photography and stuff like that. So it's great that he wrote a book that's very focused on color management for film and television.
And it's actually really readable. Like, I was surprised. I thought, oh my goodness, what am I getting myself into? I'm going to be hit with a bunch of equations and my eyes are going to glaze over real quick. But it was actually a page turner. So, he's got a really good kind of personality behind it. I think it's not dry at all. So well worth a check out. And I saw that recently you did some talking about cloud grading in the cloud. Is that something that's new for version 6? Are there going to be new tools for that? Or because I haven't actually watched it, so I'd be really interested just to have a recap on that one.
Yeah, no, it's not new for version 6. So we've been able to run Baselight in the cloud for a little while now. Initially, it was just the render engine. So if you just wanted to render or transcode a bunch of media in the cloud, that's been available for a long time. The new thing that we partnered with Amazon almost a year and a half ago now was to be able to run actually a fully interactive Baselight session in the cloud. So all the storage, all the image processing, everything was done in the cloud, and you're just getting the output streamed down to you. And of course, the big challenge for color correction is that it needs to be super interactive. If you're adjusting a trackball or a knob, you need to see the change to the image right away. If you're spinning a dial and then, a second or two later, the image changes, you're going to constantly be like overshooting or undershooting or, not knowing what you're doing. So that was the biggest thing we really had to overcome was getting that latency down. And we've basically done it. So we now have high quality image streaming with very low latency out of the cloud. Um, I s- Color grading in the cloud on its own, I think, doesn't make much sense. Like, you wouldn't do a production the traditional way and then push everything up in the cloud just to color correct it. The economics and the time involved to do that doesn't make any sense. But as studios are looking at doing more and more of their work in the cloud, already there is a lot of VFX work done in the cloud. That's pretty standard. But if you're also doing, your editing and your sound mixing and everything else, then it makes sense to, keep it in the cloud for color correction because it's possible now. And ultimately, to the colorist, it shouldn't really feel any different. They shouldn't know the difference between whether they're working on a Baselight that is in the machine room down the hall or in some cloud data center hundreds of miles away. And so that's what we worked on is just making it possible that you could work either way. And that's pretty much all working. So there's definitely, again, some economic things you have to consider with how you deploy the resources in the cloud and the time to set it all up. But the technology's there and ready.
That's amazing. I just to use a virtual machine to color grade seems like another world. One thing which is unique to Baselight is that it's a turnkey system, and you've got certain configurations that you support, and you know that is going to work. So those are the ones that you sell. Is it the same in the cloud? You found the configuration now that works, and that's the one.
Yeah, so it's still kind of preset configurations. And a big reason for that is really just for the support so that we know
Yeah.
if there's something that's not working right, it's on us. Whether it's a hardware issue, a software issue, a config issue, you have one number to call and we'll sort it out. So
That
yeah.
support is pretty incredible. While I was in the office with you that week, I was seeing the phone ringing all the time, and you were plugged into the community and helping people in real time. And the experience of using a Baselight is having that plug in to this community of people who, you're not talking to somebody who's selling it. You're talking to someone who's actually made it and who has a stake in it. Like I remember actually an anecdote of one of my friends saying, oh, I was complaining to Bob about something to do with the control surface. And he's like, oh, I actually did some of the electronics in that. What is it what's going on? Can you talk to me at all about that support aspect and just being there for people?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge part of what we do and a huge part of why I like working for FilmLight is we are, a relatively small company who's focused on color correction and focused on this industry. And it's, it is a very innovative industry. So as we said, there's, new cameras, new display devices coming out all the time, but also filmmakers are looking to push things in different directions and different ways. So we're, constantly involved in new projects and new things and new ways of doing things. And, yeah, so it's great that we can be a resource there to filmmakers or, "Oh, hey, someone just walked in the door with this camera. I've never seen it before. Is there anything I need to know? Any kind of, caveats to watch out for?" And we could tell them, "Well, here's our experience. Here's what we've discovered. And, if you learn anything new, let us know too." So sometimes we are acting as kind of like a little bit of a middleman to be able to, yeah, get firsthand experience with new cameras and new display devices, and then share that with other people who are working on them later down the line. But yeah.
And also, like, you've got all of these backwards compatible tools, like, you've got all of these legacy tools there. So, I imagine that it's not just the new technology that you're supporting. Like, if I was to unarchive something from 10 years ago now and try to get my head around it, especially if it was somebody else's job, I think I'd go crazy. So, is that also something that you're supporting, people unarchiving old jobs
That's
as well?
yeah, that's kind of one of the founding principles with the way Baselight was built is that you can go back to any Baselight you've seen, no matter how many years ago, and upgrade it, and it'll still work and produce the same image in the current release of Baselight. So yeah, I was actually just talking to someone a few days ago who had an archival project from I think it's 12 or 13 years ago. They wanted to bring back online, and they were able to. So they were able to recover that job, see exactly what was done to the image, and then tweak it from there for the new pass that they wanted to do. So yeah.
Wow. And is it true that they would be able to use the database's saved undos to go back and undo everything in that 12-year-old job?
Yeah, exactly. Again, that's just the way Baselight stores its project files. It's basically a history of every key press and every change you've done. So you can literally hit undo and see every step that was made to get to where you were. And that could be great for us in support too, because if someone gets kind of paints themselves into a corner, we can actually undo and see every step they went to get there. So we can actually pick it apart and see what was done. Yeah.
So what does your typical day look like? Are you fielding support calls a lot of the time, or are you working on, special projects or?
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, I think I'm pretty lucky in that I don't have a typical day.
That's great.
Sometimes I'm doing training with a colorist, sometimes I'm just kind of, jumping in on support calls, picking up the phone. With my background in color science, like I tend to focus more on the support calls that are much more kind of color workflow oriented or color calibration oriented, where we have other people on the support team who focus more on, technical issues integrating with storage or things like that. And then sometimes it's, just completely new projects. I actually just got back. I was in Las Vegas last weekend for the premiere of Darren Aronofsky's Postcard from Earth at the Sphere in Las Vegas,
Oh,
which is this
wow.
giant, LED wall that's, I forget how many stories, but it's like a 16,000 seat venue with a giant LED wall that completely surrounds your vision. So there were some unique challenges in getting that project over the finish line for color calibration and also just dealing with the geometry of the space and the screen and all that. So yeah.
Wow. Oh, can you tell me more about that? What was your involvement in the Sphere? Because everyone's talking about it with you two playing there.
Yeah, yeah. So some of it I'm under NDA for. I can't go into too much
Of
detail, but
course, of
uh,
course.
but yeah. So the colorist for the first kind of traditional film that was produced for the Sphere was Tim Stippen, and Andre Rivas was the assistant colorist on that. So he's supporting those guys. And what Sphere Studios, because they built a studio specifically to produce content for this venue, Sphere Studios built their own camera called the Big Sky camera. Which had a fisheye lens on it to be able to capture an 18K by 18K source image to put into the Sphere. So yeah, there was you're making sure that the color from that camera was coming into Baselight correctly, and then developing the color profiles for the venues so that when they projected stuff on the screen, it had all the right colors.
Wow.
And of course, we can't do so. The ultimately the playback in that venue is a 16K by 16K image at 60 frames per second. So it's a huge amount of data being thrown up on that screen. Obviously, you can't color correct that in real time. So most of the time, Tim and the team were working off of proxies just on a standard, Sony X310 monitor. So again, the color calibration, making sure that that monitor matched the color of the venue. And then also just dealing with the spherical mapping to be able to look at the image in different ways on that flat square to get an idea of what it would look like, when you're surrounded by it in the sphere. So yeah, a lot of fun new challenges in that.
Wow, I can't imagine. I just had this like image in my mind of them just grading and looking at the sphere, just like standing out there in, Las Vegas on the strip and with a little desk in front of them. And
yeah, we hope to get to that point at some further down the road, but also, of course, that the sphere is now very much in demand. They're doing U2 concerts there. They're playing the film regularly there, so it's not unfortunately a space you can just kind of take over for a few days and do what you want. And it's a it's a live venue, so it's building the workflow around it.
It seems like something that belongs in Dubai. It's just such a bizarre thing. Was it interesting to see in real life? Like, what did it look like as a viewer?
Yeah, no, it definitely is. It's a very immersive environment, very unique. In some ways, it's an evolution of previous dome projections, like OmniMax. IMAX had this. They still do actually have an OmniMax, which is basically IMAX film projected on a dome. Or some planetariums will have digital shows that they can project. So, in some ways, it's an evolution of that. But because it's a LED wall, there's no optical artifacts or anything like that you have to deal with in projection. It's just the light directly coming at you. It's much higher dynamic range, so you can get much deeper blacks, much brighter whites, and of course the resolution is pretty insane. So yeah, when you're sitting in that venue and it's completely filling your peripheral vision, like anytime the camera moves, you feel like you're moving.
Oh gosh.
It's just totally immersive that way. And when you're so Postcard from Earth has shots from all over the world and all these different environments. So yeah, like when you're in the underwater sequences and the waves are over your head and the fish are down in front of you, it really is much more immersive than a traditional theatrical experience. So it's really unique.
Oh, I'll definitely be heading to check it out next time I'm over, that's for sure. And you guys have a system that can deal with that large file.
Yeah, so I mean, that actually was nothing new for Baselight. We had always architected Baselight to be kind of resolution independent, and we'd always, so whatever resolution image you could throw at it, we can't promise how fast that it will be, but it will at least, produce an image and work. So again, a lot of the real-time adjustments had to be done off proxies, but, they were 4K proxies. So 4K is the proxy, and 16K was ultimately what was rendered. Yeah.
Wow. I bet that took a while to render, but it's okay. You don't have to tell me how long. Well, look, I reckon I've probably covered most of the questions that I had for you, but I just find it super interesting what you've been able to do in your career and how much everyday stuff that we take for granted, has actually been the result of committees and companies that you've worked in. And I think really it's people who are doing all of this work in the background to make sure that things really look the best that they can, that gives us colorists the ability to do what we do. So I can't thank you enough for your contribution to the craft and just for being available and having a chat and, being at the other end of the phone on support. It's awesome. So thanks a lot.
Well, thanks. Yeah, that's really nice to hear. And yeah, like I said, if the creative process is just able to go smooth and you don't even think of that technology, then we've won. That's really our goal. So.
Yeah, it feels a bit like that in coloring too. It's like if no one notices what we've done, then we've done a good job. So
right, yeah.
we're very self-effacing in this field.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Peter Postma. I'm Kaylee Bateman from Mixing Light, and I'll see you next time.